So in this video, I'm going to be reviewing Batman Arkham Asylum. I'd like to quickly clarify that this version of the game is the Return to Arkham remaster, if you want to call it that, version of the game. It is my preferred version, but not only that, it's the only one I had access to, and I don't want to go out my way to play what is essentially the same game in the original version. And without wasting any more time, here is my review on Batman Arkham Asylum in 2025. Now, getting into the world of this game, I think the visuals in both graphic fidelity but also just design are very, very well done. For a game that came out in 2009, I feel like even players who only care about realistic graphics would actually be okay with playing this game, at least I think for the most part. And in terms of the design as a whole, in terms of the map's layout, where items are placed, how it looks, the vibe, each individual horrific looking gritty rat-infested corner of Arkham Asylum I think is done very, very well. Now, although most of the characters in the game do look absolutely fine, especially Batman, I do find that there are two big exceptions to the rule of most being okay, with both Commissioner Gordon and especially Scarecrow's designs being really, really poor. I'm assuming I don't need to go in depth on who these characters are because, everybody knows Batman lore, but Scarecrow is a villain, Commissioner Gordon is a police commissioner, and both their designs are just really, really poor. But the rest of the cast are absolutely fine in their design. Another visual thing I love about this game is the fact that throughout the night, the more it progresses, Batman's suit gets more and more beat up, and by the end of the game it's very noticeable. But not just that, he actually grows a little bit of stubble, which I know this game takes place over one night, but I suppose there are people who can grow fast facial hair, so for a game that came out in 2009, it's actually a decent little detail. The UI as a whole in this game I think is done very, very well. I think the map is very easily understandable, and I feel like it doesn't baby the player in terms of there's sometimes where it'll tell you an objective where it doesn't specify exactly where you need to go, but you can figure it out with ease, especially given the map's size. And going through all the menus from settings to the collectibles and character bios, I feel like it's all accessible with relative ease, and the menus in this game are at the very least solid, if not actually pretty good. Now, if you know anything about Arkham, you'll know about Riddler trophies, and this game is the first to introduce them, as well as some other Riddler-esque challenges. Now, they're in Arkham Asylum, they're in its sequel Arkham City, and the sequel after that, Arkham Knight. But this game, even though it is the oldest and the first to introduce them, I think does it better than any of these games. Whether it's because of the condensed map, or the layout of the map, or just what the puzzles are themselves, I just feel like the puzzles in this game are far more intriguing, and I have much more fun spending the couple of hours getting all the trophies in this game after beating the game than I would in any other game. Not only is it shorter, but I genuinely think the quality of the puzzles is just far better. In Arkham City, the game straight after, there's just far too many, there's double the amount, and you have to get them with two different characters, that being Batman and Catwoman. And then in Arkham Knight, they're just simply not as enjoyable in terms of the challenges you have to do to get them, in my opinion. There's a reason I've 100%ed this game twice, but not 100%ed any other Arkham game, simply because of the Riddler trophies being annoying most of the time. The only other collectible in the game is interview tapes, and I think all the interview tapes are really interesting, and sometimes I will, whilst playing the game, just listen to them, and you can actually listen to them while moving throughout the world, which is really cool, although sometimes they will randomly just cut out, although I'm sure there's a reason for that, maybe it's entering a new area, etc. My biggest issue with the interview tapes is simply that other games in the series, so the prequel to Arkham Asylum and the two sequels, both make a lot of these interview tapes non-canon, which sucks, especially because some of them are pretty good. That being said, it's absolutely fine, and it doesn't ruin the experience of this specific game. And the last thing with character designs, I did speak earlier about there only being two characters I was not very fond of. I was kind of lying when I said it was only two, because I do have an issue with the standard enemy designs, the thugs you fight throughout the game, not the main antagonists, just the one you find throughout the world. There's about 4 or 5 normal thugs, and that's about it. And then you get introduced to an enemy later on called the Lunatic, and I swear there's only one variant of that, maybe 2, maybe. I didn't notice any difference between any of them. And this is something the game that came out just 3 years later, I believe it was 3 years later, Arkham City, does a heck of a lot better. And you might think it's unfair for me to criticize this game for something that a predecessor improves upon, but I do think even for 2009, I do think there is a severe lack of character depth in terms of enemy design. Now, moving on to gameplay, this combat is, it's revolutionary, isn't it, in terms of just combat in games, the amount of games that have been inspired by the Arkham combat, and this is what started it all. The combat is really, really good. Now, it isn't as good as later entries simply because, it is the first and it is the most technically challenged. That being said, I still find it really, really good and it holds up relatively well. In fact, I think it holds up very well indeed. Although it feels really harsh to criticize what is a revolutionary combat system, there were a lot of times where enemies would hit you, but they didn't seem to even connect anywhere near you. The hitboxes seemed a bit off there, and also, at least on the hard difficulty, which I was playing on, the enemies seem to slide across the ground, so they'll go for a punch, and you're like, oh, well, they can't hit me because they're too far away, and then they'll just like slide up and hit you, and it's not particularly great, even for the time period this game came out. But insulting this combat system does seem like rather idiotic simply due to the fact that it is so very good and so very revolutionary, and I've used that word about 5 or 6 times now, but it is true. I love how the combat is super simple in terms of the amount of buttons you have to click for each individual move, but looks and feels far more complex. With this, the game becomes easy to learn but hard to master, and I really, really like that. If you don't know anything about Arkham, you'll be looking at the combat on screen and assuming I'm pressing so many different buttons, but I'm pressing usually only 2, and then I might put in a third there. And then to counter, there's a counter button, a jump button, or you hold it to run, but you can also double tap it to jump over enemies or dodge enemies. There's a strike button, and then there's a button for your quick batarang, and then a button for your quick back claw. And that's it. That's every single control in the entire game, which sounds like a negative, but it's actually really well done considering how few buttons there are. I really do like as well when a combo move is executable, which is when you just click 2 certain buttons together and then you can instantly finish off an enemy. The game slowly freezes for a second, so even if you don't look at the side of the screen, which it tells you that there is a combo executable, I feel like you can kind of tell and kind of be ready for it, and I really like that in case you forget when the last time you got the combo was, to be able to instantly take down an enemy. That being said, you fight a lot of these enemies in the game called Titans, which are these bigger Hulk-like enemies, and every single time you need to dodge them, at least when you're attacking them. You throw a batarang at them, and it blinds them, and then they run into a wall, and that's how you damage them for the most part. But you have to dodge them when doing this, and it always goes in slow motion, and at least on hard difficulty, I wish it didn't go in slow motion. Now, I understand it's to make it a lot easier, and maybe if I played it without slow motion, it would actually be impossible, I'm unsure, but although I find that very unlikely. But I just felt the constant slow motion in this part was rather annoying, especially the amount of times you fight these Titans throughout the game. Now, thugs with guns, at least in fully fledged combat scenarios, not in stealth sections, which I'll get onto later, never seem to use their guns, and I'm unsure why. Now, at least on hard mode, and I keep prefacing I was on hard mode because it maybe should be different for easy or normal, but at least on hard mode, I find that they maybe should have used them a bit more. It was relatively easy to fight a thug with a gun in a combat encounter. And I also want to quickly mention that when an enemy goes to hit you and you click the above button, either the triangle button or the Y button or whatever it is on PC to counter their attack, usually there is a little blue icon above their head to counter them, but on hard difficulty there isn't a counter icon, which is why you don't see it in my gameplay. But in general, that usually is a thing, and I think it's done very well. Now, getting onto the stealth sections of the game, known in the fanbase as the Predator sections, I think they are all done pretty well. There wasn't a single one, I think, that I was utterly annoyed at, I thought was stupid. And on hard difficulty, if you are spotted, you are most likely going to end up deceased. There was only once, maybe twice in the entire game I was spotted and managed to actually get away. It's very, very difficult. And unlike some of the older games, or sorry, newer games in the series, you actually don't have the option to drop smoke to be invisible from the enemies for a short period as like a get out of jail free card. So that does make it a lot harder as well. Later on in the game, you get introduced to these things called suicide collars, which basically means once an enemy is knocked out by Batman, it starts lighting up, like flashing, and a noise plays, and basically that alerts guards to that location of that fallen enemy, so you can't stick around an area too long. I like this for a few reasons. One, because the lore of the suicide collar is actually decent. It's decently explained in lore. But not just that, it actually makes Predator encounters feel different when it's introduced, although it is introduced probably about the midpoint in the game, maybe slightly earlier than that. But when it's introduced, you can actually use it to your advantage. So there's a gadget that's called explosive gel, where you can put the explosive gel near an enemy and then take an enemy out, put the gel there, and then wait till the enemies go over and then use it, right? So I feel like it doesn't only make the combat encounters harder, but you can adapt to it, and I really do like that. My only issue here is after the suicide collar is introduced, it's pretty much, if not, I could be wrong here and it's actually in every single one, but I know it's definitely in most of the combat encounters, the predator section or stealth section encounters afterwards. And I do think it's just overstates its welcome a little bit. It would be nice if it spiced up a little bit, or maybe there was one guard or enemy, with a suicide collar, one without, so you have to kind of pick and choose who you take out, I suppose. Not that it would be difficult either way, I just find it is maybe a little overused at some points. Speaking of which, the gadgets in this game are really well done. You only start off with the batarangs, I believe, during the game, maybe the batclaw as well, but throughout the game's playtime, so whilst progressing the campaign, you unlock more and more gadgets, and they all feel like meaningful pickups that help you along your journey. And not only that, they also feel lore friendly in terms of they don't just come out of thin air. For example, there's a point where Batman needs to get across a gap, so he calls in the Batwing himself and then gets a line launcher or a zip line so he can get across a gap, and then you use that throughout the rest of the game. Or he goes to the Batmobile, and the Batmobile has explosive gel in, which he then uses to blow up a wall straight after. So I just find that the way you both get the gadgets, but also the gadgets themselves, are pretty solid. I will say that if they allowed the gadgets to be on like a wheel that could select a gadget, like a weapon wheel, for example, I feel like they could have freed up the D-pad, because every single gadget is just on the D-pad. That being said, I'm not sure when weapon wheels were really heavily introduced. Maybe around 2009 it wasn't a popular thing. The first weapon wheel I remember, but there could have been one earlier than this, is from Grand Theft Auto 5, which came out in 2013. So maybe weapon wheels weren't as popular. And in Arkham Knight, which came out in 2015, they do end up having a weapon wheel, or a gadget wheel, I suppose you'd call it. So maybe it just wasn't a popular thing around 2009, but I do think, so maybe that's something that's harsh to criticise the game for, because it wasn't really a thing back then. Maybe that is the case. But if it was a thing back then, I do think that would have been something that would have been kind of nice to implement. But if it wasn't, then this point's irrelevant. I felt like the upgrade tree, personally, was just very boring, and that's nothing to do with the fact that the other games just improve upon it tenfold. I just feel like once you get about 3/4 through the game, like the last 4 upgrades for myself personally, I just picked whatever, because I really didn't care about the upgrades. You do need the vast majority of them, at least the gadget upgrades, to get every single Riddler trophy. So if you're going to Platinum or 100% the game, then you do need to get pretty much all the upgrades, besides the one that helps you in combat, but like at least the gadget upgrades. But at least for me, who's beat the game 100% twice and wasn't going for every single Riddler trophy, I really had little interest in like a remote control Batarang, which in this game, unlike other games, isn't as useful. It can still be useful, but it's just a lot of these upgrades just really weren't that interesting. And there were certain things like being able to instantly take down an enemy after a certain combo, or an inverted takedown from a gargoyle, that I just feel like should have probably not been upgrades anyway, just standard parts of the game. I almost think that with an inverted takedown being an upgrade, you could argue that maybe a silent takedown should then be an upgrade, or I don't know when it stops. I don't think an inverted takedown personally should be an upgrade, which is when you're on a gargoyle and an enemy walks under it, you can string them up from the gargoyle. And I don't know. There's just certain upgrades that I feel like either shouldn't be upgrades, or there should just be a lot more. I think there's 20 overall, and it does sound really ungrateful, but it did get to a point where later on in the game I was just really bored of upgrades. I just picked whatever. I think for the last 3 or 4 upgrades, nothing that I was interested in. I just thought I might as well spend my upgrade point. And the last thing I want to mention on gameplay is detective mode, which is a staple in the Arkham series. Now, it's not quite thermal vision, as I've seen some people mention it as, but basically you can see enemies through walls if you click, I believe on a PlayStation controller, well, I know on an Xbox it's LB, I'm unsure, even though I have a PlayStation, what it is on is it L2 maybe, or L1? Anyway, clicking this button, it lets you go into detective mode, which then shows up in all the later series moving forward, and it's basically just an in-universe way for you to be able to see everything on the map at once, like see enemies through walls, you can see items that are interactable, like the aforementioned Riddler trophies, walls that you can blow up with explosive gel, certain things like hitting something with a Batarang for a quest to continue or progress. That's the same thing, but the detective mode is just very good. It's a very good in-universe explanation as to why Batman can seemingly see through walls and do all this crazy stuff, and it also makes a player feel stronger, but without taking away any lore implications in doing that. And it's a very, very useful aspect to the game, and it's something I would be remiss to mention. Now, moving on to my biggest issue with the game, and that would be the boss fights. I feel that the boss fights in this game, especially considering what comes later in the series, is just really, really poor. And I know, yet again, it's probably harsh for me to criticise this game for something that we get later on, considering this is the first game, but I feel like even for the time, the boss fights are just not very good. I mean, starting off, we've got the Titan fights, which I'm all just going to clump together as one, and I can't remember exactly how many times you fight Titans, but I know there's at least five different boss fights that include Titans, which are these big enemies. If you even want to call them all boss fights, they're like mini bosses, and some of them do have health bars, thus you could pretty much call them bosses, right? Or mini bosses, I suppose. Every single one is the exact same, where you throw a batarang at them, they'll smash into a wall, and then, as I spoke about earlier, and then you just pummel them, and then rinse and repeat. And then with the later ones, they'll throw in some goons. And it's something I'm not a big fan of in general when in boss fights in most games, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but most of the time in games when they have to add extra enemies to a boss to make the boss harder or more interesting, I just feel like they've failed at the boss. And that's not all the time like universal, but I just feel like, at least in my experience and my personal opinion, the majority of the time this happens, I just feel like it's more annoyance and makes the boss even worse, or is basically just them saying, yes, we know our boss is bad, but here we're going to scatter some random thugs, random enemies here, some standard enemies, just so you've got something else to do and you're not fighting this poorly designed boss. And what sucks about this is that one of the main antagonists in the game, and if you know anything about Batman, you'll know him, Bane, uses pretty much the exact same movement patterns, or the exact same attack patterns, as the Titans. He is basically just a Titan. I think he's the first proper one you fight. There is one you fight beforehand, which I'll speak about in a minute, but he's the first one I think he fights. The only difference with him is that he grabs chunks out of the wall to throw at you, and the other Titans, the more generic ones, throw bodies at you that are strewn about on the floor, like either dead bodies or knocked out guards. But I believe that's the only change. Oh, and also Bane does regenerate health, but it's so slightly, even on hard, it's not it doesn't make a big difference really, but they're the only differences, and other than that, he's just a Titan. So it's really disappointing. Not only is Bane just a Titan, but the amount of Titan fights you get, it does get to the point where it gets really tedious, repetitive, and it'd be fine with one or two, but it's just not very interesting. The only Titan I actually don't mind is the very first one you interact with, which is like a prototype Titan, I believe it's called, at least in the community, where it's the Titan that Joker made, which we'll get into when we talk about story. But the Joker makes these Titans, like he's created these Titans, and he shows Batman this one that he's created, like it's the first Titan you see, but you can clearly see it's a bit peculiar in the fact that like one arm's a lot smaller than the other, and he's not quite right compared to the rest of the Titans that you fight later on in the game. And the Titan actually ends up having a heart attack. Like, you actually don't even need to attack this Titan. If you just run around in circles, it will eventually have a heart attack. But if you attack it, it'll just then have a heart attack anyway, and that's how the Titan dies. And I know people claim this to be really boring, but the reason I like it more than all the other Titan fights is because, one, at least there's something unique about the design of it. The rest just look the exact same, besides Bane, I suppose, but I suppose Bane isn't technically a Titan, but I mean, it pretty much is. But two, there's actually some cool lore implications with this Titan. So it has a heart attack, and it shows you that the formula that Joker's cooked up to make these Titans isn't quite perfect yet, and I kind of like that. It's a bit of visual storytelling. I mean, I think it's straight up mentioned as well. But yeah, the Titan fights, including Bane, I just think are really, really poor. They're so common, and considering the game is only about 7-8 hours long, I genuinely think there's far too many of them. I think there's at least 5. I'm not sure on the exact number, but I know there is a lot, and it's just not enjoyable. Now, a boss that everybody seems to absolutely adore when it comes to Batman Arkham Asylum is Scarecrow. Now, I'm going to take a different stance on this, and it might be one that's maybe a bit more in the controversial category, I'm not sure, or less popular opinion, but I think Scarecrow's boss fight, if you do call it a boss fight, and I'm classing it as a boss fight here, in which you have to run around, it happens 3 times throughout the game, and you have to run around and avoid his gaze, otherwise he will spot you. But I find his boss fight quite overrated. Now, it's absolutely fine, and I do like how they've had something else as a confrontation that isn't just a big health bar do damage, and Scarecrow, because his whole thing is fear, maybe it wouldn't make sense for him to have like a boss fight where you have to pound him down, right? Like, this is a bit more in line with Scarecrow. I suppose you're not confronting him in terms of he has a health bar and you have to fight him the same way you would fight Bane or Clayface or Ra's al Ghul, something like that, right? So I do like that aspect of it, but I do think overall they're a bit overrated. I do think After the first one especially, it does get a bit like, oh, okay, I just want to get through it. It's not that interesting. And in the second and third confrontation, you also do have a mini, like, goon fight, but they're skeletons instead of, like, your regular goons, and they do die a lot quicker. But I just found it to be a little repetitive. Now, they're not bad by any means, and it's definitely one of the best boss fights, if you include all three together, definitely one of the best boss encounters throughout the entire game. The thing is with Scarecrow, if you're going to count the build-ups to his boss fight as part of the boss itself, I think it is one of the best bosses in the Arkham series easily. I think the build-up to the boss, especially the third and final confrontation, which has the game have a fake, and this is well known if you know anything about Arkham Asylum, where the game fake crashes, and then you seemingly die, and then it turns out, oh no, it was actually a joke, and then you go into the Scarecrow confrontation. I think because it's like how Scarecrow's fear gas is affecting you, and it's affecting the actual player, it seems like it's almost like a fourth wall break. Well, it is a fourth wall break, and it's really, really cool. But even the second one, or the second build-up, and the first build-up, you believe that the commissioner's dead when he's actually not. Stuff like, and I think these build-ups are really, really good, but the actual confrontation with Scarecrow is not as good. So basically what I'm trying to say is the build-up is 10 out of 10 in some cases. I do prefer the third a lot more than the other two, but in general, the build-up is far better than the execution at the end. The actual boss fight itself is just far lower, I think, than the actual build-up to Scarecrow. I think the way the world manipulates itself, especially with that fake crash, is really, really cool. But then when you actually do you can't be seen by the hide and seek with Scarecrow, that part of the boss, I just feel like it's thing. And that's what I count as the boss. I don't count the build-up as part of the boss. Otherwise, I suppose the final confrontation boss with Joker, which we'll get onto in a minute, would be being built up for the entire game, I suppose you could argue. So the entire game's the boss, right? I don't know. Like, I just personally don't, for the Scarecrow, count the build-up as a boss. I did see a video where someone rated this boss. They were going through all boss rank, rating every single boss in the Arkham series, and they counted the build-up as part of the boss. That's fine. Just for me, I don't. Thus, I don't think the Scarecrow boss is actually as good as people give it credit for. It's still absolutely fine, though. Speaking of which, I just want to mention again, that fake crash is absolutely awesome. Poison Ivy is a boss that I remember I used to think was decent, and now looking back on it, is a boss that I don't find actually that good. She's got very few attacks. She actually has two phases, but the second phase, once you get to it, is a checkpoint, even on hard mode. So even if you die, you get that checkpoint. But I just feel like Poison Ivy is, I mean, maybe one of the most average bosses in the Arkham series as a whole, but especially in this game. Well, one of the better ones in this game, because I think the ones in this game are quite lackluster, so I take that back. But in the Arkham series as a whole, I think Poison Ivy is just mid. She's absolutely fine. I do actually think Scarecrow is more interesting of an encounter, especially because of the build-up, of course, but even the actual encounter itself. But she's far better than Bane, for example, and all the other Titan fights. She's just average. I think it's absolutely acceptable. Killer Croc is like Scarecrow, where it isn't a stereotypical boss fight in terms of there's a health bar and you just have to whittle down the health bar. And it's actually kind of especially if you're younger, but even for someone who is an adult, I do think it's quite a tense encounter and you would be a little scared. Well, scared's maybe an over-exaggeration, but tense, especially considering this isn't a horror game or doesn't claim to be. And basically you've just got to crouch around, and well, I mean, you'll see it in the gameplay now, I'm sure. And basically Killer Croc will jump up occasionally and you have to hit them with a batarang, or they'll grab you and game over. Although checkpoints in this area are relatively forgiving, and you have to go around, collect five like spores to create an antidote for the Titan formula, which I spoke about earlier with the Titans. But Killer Croc, I think overall, I mean, I've not got as much to say about Killer Croc than I have Scarecrow. I think the gameplay kind of speaks for itself. I feel like it's a very good encounter, up there with Scarecrow, maybe even better. The way you have to run away from Killer Croc at the end, and then you blow him up with explosive gel and he falls down. I think overall the encounter is quite tense, and if you've not played it, like I've played this game many times before, thus I kind of know what I'm doing right. But if you're somebody who's never played the game before, I can definitely see this being an intense encounter that you might die a few times on, especially if you're not expecting Killer Croc to just jump up, because obviously I've played it before, so I know, to keep constantly be on my guard. But it can be tense, and you definitely don't want to be restarting constantly, so you're still going to try your damnedest. So I think it's an okay encounter. Harley Quinn's fight, if you want to call it a boss, it's another one where it's a bit hard if you class it as a boss or not. But it's, in my opinion, the least boss-esque type of fight in the game. Basically, you're in a room where the floor turns to electric, which I don't know what this room actually would have been used for in an asylum, but that's by the by. There's like 3 levels to this room, like 3 floors, I should say, because 2 of them are on the same level. And you basically have to go between all three because one will turn to electric, the other one turns to electric, etc., etc. And if you're caught in it, and if a fog's caught in it, I think they instantly get knocked out. And if you get caught in it for long enough, you die. So it doesn't really make sense. But I mean, it's a game, it's fine. But I just feel like, I mean, you don't actually ever fight Harley Quinn directly. It's always just, I mean, there's 2 encounters with her, but only one is really counted as the boss fight, and they're just both with thugs. And I think it's a fine idea for a thug encounter in general to have the floors constantly changing, you have to constantly keep moving, although it's not difficult at all, and not as tense as maybe the gameplay makes it look. That being said, I think for a final boss, well, it's not a final boss, I'm definitely over-exaggerating there, I'm going way past the post, but for a final encounter with a certain antagonist, quite a big one of that, Harley Quinn's quite well known, I just feel like it's quite disappointing. I feel like this might be the worst boss in the game if you're going to call it a boss. I actually think I prefer the Titan fights over this, but it's not, like, in my mind, I don't really see it as a boss, it's just that people do mention it as a boss, and it is the fall of a main antagonist, so I might as well mention it, right? And the final encounter with Joker is really, really bad. Joker basically, and I'll talk a bit more about this when I talk about story, I'm sure, but Joker shoots himself with Titan after being confronted with Batman, and then fights Batman as a Titan form. But I mean, just look at the gameplay, his Titan form looks silly, but not only that, the boss fight is far too easy. The Titan fight just before this is more difficult. Joker looks stupid, and it's just not a way that the Joker character I really feel like should be portrayed at the end of this game. I don't know, the Joker throughout the entire game in this game is maybe one of, out of all the Arkham games, my favourites. I think the only one that might top him is the very next game, which is Arkham City, but I like Joker in Arkham Asylum quite a lot. Mark Hamill did a fabulous job and the writing was fabulous. I just feel like this final confrontation just almost threw that all out the window. It's very, very poor, and he's very easy. I mean, he's basically almost like Harley Quinn. I think a lot of people maybe don't talk about this, but he's kind of like Harley Quinn in the fact that he's not really a boss because it's just a thug encounter, and then once you beat the thugs, then you attack him, and then you beat the thugs. So it's a bit more of a boss than Harley, I suppose, but it's still just, and then the amount of bosses in this game, quote-unquote bosses, that have just thugs, even Poison Ivy, I forgot to mention, has random thugs come in that she's possessed, right? So I just feel like that's just an admittance that our bosses are not particularly good from Rocksteady. They're just saying, yeah, we know these bosses aren't that good, but here's some thugs to kind of spice up the gameplay, right? That's the way I see it. I am very disappointed with the bosses in this game, and like I said, I've said this 3 or 4 times now, I don't think that the bosses are bad because we're looking at it in retrospect because of the newer games, Arkham City, which has my favourite boss of all time, or Arkham Knight, which I still do think, although people dislike the bosses in that, are probably still better. Arkham Origins has better bosses. It's not because of that. I generally think even for a game that came out in 2009, and all the good stuff they did in this game, I do think that the bosses were just lackluster. I don't think it has anything to do with looking back in retrospective. I generally just think the bosses are poor overall, with maybe Scarecrow and Killer Croc being the only ones you could call good. I think the rest are either average or far below. So oversimplifying the story, but basically Joker escapes, you fight a bunch of people to get to Joker. Joker is trying to get his hands on this Titan formula, which you saw with the Titan enemies earlier. He does end up getting his hand on it, but Batman obviously at the end stops him, and then he's sent back to, well, a working Arkham Asylum, I suppose. I said sent back to, I suppose he never left. But that is basically the game in a nutshell. It's very, very oversimplified, but I just really want to talk about the good and bad points I thought about the story and not dive extremely in depth. So first of all, I want to talk about how Joker's escape at the start I believe is a little silly. He just kind of, I mean, you'll see it in the gameplay now, or cutscene now, I suppose. I just find it a bit silly. It's not the biggest deal, and it's a very minor gripe. I just find it to be a little goofy, I suppose, and I feel like there could have been a better way for him to escape. Joker's dialogue throughout the game is absolutely great. He, throughout the game, talks to you on the intercom. You get the very well-known Arkham Asylum jingle, or chime, I suppose it would be, and then he speaks to you over the intercom throughout the entire game, and I love his banter. Obviously, Batman never talks back to him, well, very rarely. Sometimes in cutscenes he does. And I just think Mark Hamill does a very, very good job with Joker. I mean, it might be also the script he was given, although I don't know how much he improvised or not, but I do like Joker's dialogue throughout your traversal of the asylum. Scarecrow is absolutely great. I mentioned him earlier. I love the build-up to his fights, and I think Scarecrow is done better in this game than he is in Arkham Knight, which is the, at this point, newest AAA Batman Arkham game. And I should count Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League, but I mean, yeah. And he's the main character, or one of the main, sorry, not main character, one of the main antagonists in Arkham Knight. and I feel like he's done a lot better in this than in Arkham Knight personally. So I do really like Scarecrow in this game, and him along with Joker are the two major positives when it comes to antagonists in this game for me personally. And obviously we have the death screens, which are one of the most popular or one of the most well-known parts of the game, and they're in all subsequent Arkham games where you die and then a character will come on screen, whether it's a Joker, you'll be seeing a compilation of them now where they'll come on screen and they'll kind of like talk to Batman as if he's dying or dead. But yeah, it's very well known for it. There's not much to say about it. I just think it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. Although I do not think Arkham Asylum has anywhere near the best of these death screens. So I know I very briefly spoke on the boss fights there, but I just wanted to say that, overall I liked the story. I thought it was solid. It's, in my opinion, not the weakest of the stories. I do think the story is a lot stronger from what my memory serves, at the very least, than Arkham Origins, for example, and possibly Knight, although I don't think it quite holds a candle to Arkham City. However, if you're looking for an extremely good story game, I don't know if I would suggest this personally. And I know I talked very briefly about the story, but it's just one of the least interesting parts of this review that I wanted to mention. I'm not saying the story is bad by any means, but I just don't really have any interest to go deep into the story. But I think basically it's acceptable, but nothing spectacular, I think is the best way to put the story. Now, just for fun, I want to talk about a few silly things I found in the game, just for a little bit of fun, and none of these are meant to be taken seriously, or at least most of them, I suppose. So first off is when Joker escapes, he kicks a guard in the head, and then that guard is then dead, and I feel like you can die from a kick to the head, of course, but it just seems a bit silly, so I just wanted to point this out. There's a guard named Steve in a room with gas that you've got to save him. You've got to pull him up because he's dangling and he might fall into the gas. And how he got in this position, I have no idea. I'm just trying to think how he managed to get into this position whilst the room was filling up with gas. It really puzzles me. It's a really particular, or peculiar rather, area to get yourself stuck in. Also, in this gameplay you're seeing now, you'll see me go through these 4 blinds, I believe. I think that's what they're called. And all 4 of them have got the exact same blood splatter on. It just looks a bit silly. And I don't actually think this was in the original version of the game. The room that you will see in this gameplay now, also, if you look at it, the layout is rather peculiar. I have no idea how people are meant to get in and out of this room. There's no ladder, there's no stairs. It just looks a bit peculiar. It seems like the room was built for Batman's grappling hook. And last but not least, I found it really peculiar that if you look at the heart attack titan that I spoke on earlier, if you go into detective mode, it says myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack. But then if you look at any other dead NPC in the game, it just says they're deceased. So it's a bit of an inconsistency that it tells you the specific cause of death for one NPC, but then for every other NPC, it doesn't. So it just seems a bit silly. They added a cool detail for one dead NPC, but not any of the others. It just seems silly. Anyway, before I end off the video, I want to just show a compilation of cool little details, or just things, I suppose, without any commentary. There'll be some text explaining them, I suppose, but I just wanted to show a little compilation, and then I'll outro the video.
Transport to upper floors is now permitted to staff with correct security clearance. Security level is now at Orange Alpha. Alpha. Ha, 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 ha.
Hello? What's happening there? I'm trying to contact Steve. Is he there?
Hold 1 second. I'll see if I can find him.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I've looked everywhere. I can only find his head. I'll get back to you when I find the rest of them. You're late for your appointment. Very rude. Well, seeing as you're here now, we might as well get started. Tell me about your childhood. Anything stand out? I'm afraid I cannot attend your appointment today, but Dr. Quinzel has kindly offered to sit in.
Stupid bat! Always bothering Mr. J with your problems. You'll never be as dreamy as him. You're just an ugly, stupid bat in a trap.
Let's talk about employee relations, Bats. Harley disappointed me, and now she's out of the picture. Gone, forgotten, dead to me. You get the idea. Patient continues to show bizarre and irrational tendencies. On continued observation, it is clear that he believes he can in some way influence the inevitable destruction of this city. So what will it be, Bats? You and me caught in this eternal struggle. One destined to kill the other. What will we do when one of us wins? I once went to a psychiatrist. Doc, I said, every time I get into bed, I think there's somebody under it. I get under the bed, I think there's somebody on top of it. I was going crazy, so I cured myself. I cut the legs off my bed, and then the doctor. Slept fine ever since. Excited, Bats? I mean, we've been building up to this point all night. Don't tell me you've not been looking forward to it. I know I have. Surprise! Everyone always said I should be in television. You don't want to miss this, really. It'll be a blast.
All right.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you very much for watching this review. If you disagree with any of my points, please let me know in the comment section below, or if you heavily agree with absolutely everything I said. But yeah, thank you very much for watching this critique on Batman Arkham Asylum.